I think it's pretty safe to say that the mid to late 90s was the premier time for innovation in video games. Not only did it usher in the birth of the 3D era, but it was also a breeding ground in which developers took the time to ask, hey, how can we do things differently? Never before had there been such a freedom for experimentation, and while there was quite a bit of failure along the way, the ideas that stuck left a lasting impact that influenced the industry as a whole. So allow me to introduce the original Sony PlayStation controller. By today's standards, it's a pretty basic novelty that excels at drumming up nostalgia, but at the time of release, it was exactly what you'd expect with a D-pad and face buttons. The craziest thing about it was the addition of the L2 and R2 triggers, expanding upon what Nintendo had introduced with the SNES. Speaking of Nintendo, this. Now, no matter how much of a monstrosity you may or may not consider this three-pronged beast to be, you've got to acknowledge that it popularized the thumbstick. But there was still room for improvement, to which Sony responded with the first dual analog controller in 1997. However, this was a mere footnote in the annals of joystick history, as later that same year, an even more advanced iteration would be released with a far more iconic name, the DualShock. It had everything from before, plus a little something extra, vibration. And the cherry on top was that it was all built in. See, while Nintendo spearheaded controller feedback with the Rumble Pack, Sony refined the idea with an internal system that not only made use of two motors, but was also free from having to deal with any add-ons. And from that point forward, it was all about analog, with games like Spyro the Dragon and Crash Bandicoot Warped having full compatibility with precision that was impossible otherwise. Hell, even previously released games got in on the fun, like Resident Evil, though that's easily the worst example I could have come up with for a myriad of obvious reasons. But the focus was always on the left stick, with the right often neglected entirely. A few games would find a sensible use for it, often in regards to camera control, but come May of 1999, an innocent little romp would revolutionize the entire concept. And did it do it in a way that nobody expected? That's right, I'm finally talking about Ape Escape, a 3D platformer developed by Sony's Japan studio with the intent of making full use of the DualShock. So much so it was the first and only game to outright require it. That was a pretty big deal back in 1999, and I'd wager there were more than a few kids disappointed to learn it upon boot up. You also have to imagine the confusion from the parents. What do you mean it doesn't work? Buy another controller? Are you kidding? Ape Escape follows the adventures of Spike, a 10-year-old whose job is catching a whole lot of monkeys. Turns out a rather mischievous one named Spectre's gotten his paws on an intelligence-boosting helmet, leading an Ape Escape, as it were, through various points in history. Tasked with rounding all of them up, Spike's outfitted with numerous gadgets invented by the professor, each of which aids him greatly in not only capturing the wily peepos, but also traversing the multitude of locations and tangling with the fauna. The primary of the bunch are the stun baton and net, with the former providing a hearty thwack that temporarily dazes the apes, and the latter proving essential to containing them. But Spike's gonna need all the help he can get, what with the likes of radars, dash hoops, and sky flyers. Using these gadgets is key to succeeding, as the apes differ by stats, which is represented by their pants color. Yellow are the most common with no real strength or weakness, but there are others like red who are quick to attack, green who have the best eyesight, and even black who need to be approached with utmost caution. These dudes are nothing but trouble with their slick shades and machine guns, airing it out whenever threatened. Fortunately, the peepos are easy to read thanks to their helmets. A blue light means they're calm, yellow on alert, and red, which is an attack flee mode. It's here you've got to be the most careful, as they'll do anything to escape, dropping banana peels, firing off laser guns, and even launching rockets. But it isn't always that simple, as some of them are even more complicated, what with being able to fly UFOs, pilot mechs, and even ride on the back of dinosaurs. So paying attention to your surroundings is a great help when on the hunt. As I said before, Ape Escape's biggest draw is its maximized use of the DualShock. It's got analog control and vibration, sure, but through an effort of innovation, insanity, or possibly both, the right stick is made to use every item. Swinging, spinning, driving RC cars, Japan Studio made it so that every fluid motion translates into an on-screen action that, as silly as it sounds, sends the overall immersion even into the stratosphere. What's amazing is that it manages to do it all without ever coming off as even remotely gimmicky. It makes sense to press down so you can ready the slingshots, and it feels incredibly natural to push and pull both sticks while driving the tank. It does get a bit janky during the moments where you have to paddle a boat, but these are not only few and far between, but also easily overshadowed by everything that works perfectly. And I feel as though I have to stress that Ape Escape was the first game in the history of ever to do something as ambitious as this. So to be able to talk about how well it holds up over 2 decades after release is quite frankly a bit unbelievable. But that also means the rest of the controls are just as unorthodox. The face buttons are reserved for item mapping, the D-pad lets you maneuver the fully 3D camera, so you better get acquainted with the claw, and the R1 button is used to jump. Yes, a platformer where R1 makes you jump. And guess what? It's some of the best platforming on the PS1. Not only can Spike grab ledges, climb stuff, and double jump, but a few of the gadgets enhance his abilities by allowing him to not only run faster, but also perform a triple jump. That is, a jump followed by another jump and then another jump, as well as the ability to hover in the air for a bit before descending to the ground. This is one 10-year-old you don't want to mess with, especially since he excels at catching apes, and we all know how terrifying chimpanzees can be. Each peepo is essentially a puzzle that needs solving, and one of the best things about the game is that everything from information to gadgets is drip-fed to the player. You'll only ever go up against tougher monkeys when you have the means to do so, which not only leads to a great sense of progression, but also replayability, as it's only with some of the later tools that you can access the hard-to-reach areas. It makes for an organic experience that's free from any real bullshit, since the power to get things done is in your hands, with no discernible difficulty spikes that result in frustration. It's got its tough moments, sure, but it's always fair, and that's thanks wholly to its fluid control and master design. Spike can also pick up cookies to replenish any lost health, as well as energy chips worth either 1 or 5, with 100 granting an extra life. Less common are the 1-up shirts and Spectre coins that call for thorough exploration. The amount of these varies from level to level, but they're ultimately used to unlock bonus mini-games like Ski Kids Racing, Spectre Boxing, and Galaxy Monkey. These two make clever use of the analog sticks with individual control over the poles and boxing gloves, and even a straight-up twin-stick shooter. It's nice to go back to a time before DLC, and while these modes are little more than a fun way to kill 10 minutes, they're a welcome addition that adds to the overall value. This is just a great game that's unlike any other platformer of the time, with incredible theming, catchy music, and of course, a use of analog sticks that's yet to be totally replicated. Excluding sequels, I can only think of a few other games that attempt something similar, but Ape Escape does it in a way that's so natural both in and out of the game that it retains its spot atop the throne of awesome analog stickage. It's also Chad as hell since it uses that same approach to give an equal amount of focus to every other button on the DualShock, and as we all know, true kings raise others up.
Hey, Spike, did the professor finish the time station yet? Are we gonna get to go back in time?
He said he'd be finished with it today. Let's go.
That voice acting, though, is just no good. Wooden dialogue aside, all of the kid characters sound far too old, and I often found that it was easily drowned out by the background music. I'm aware that things are a bit different with the European and Japanese versions, so please, try to remember that I'm talking about things present only in the North American release. I guess I should also mention the very names of the characters vary by country as well, with Spike being named Kakaru in the Japanese release, though that's nothing compared to his buddy Jake, who was called Buzz in Europe and Hiroki in Japan. But regardless of whichever version's your favorite, fans of Ape Escape all seem to agree on one thing: the soundtrack is awesome. I've already mentioned how catchy the music is, but that was me keeping it brief. In reality, it kicks ass. From the title screen to the stage select to the final boss, every track has this insane party quality to it that manages to encapsulate feelings of comfort, fun, and chaos. Goes pretty well with rounding up rowdy monkeys if I do say so myself, especially since many of them do a good job of representing those feelings. It was composed by Soichi Terada, who got to start producing house music in the late 80s, with his own personal touch being that of Eastern jungle elements. That's actually a big reason for the game's musical identity, rather than going a whimsical route, which I want to say I think would have worked fine, but might have clashed with all of the sciencey stuff. Terada took his niche and used it to craft something truly special. And it's chock full of neat little details, like how whenever Spike crawls around, everything gets quiet. The tracks would ultimately be remixed in 2011 with the Ape album, which is a beautiful ode to the compositions that preserves their original quality whilst simultaneously updating them in numerous ways. On that note, it seems a lot of people would love for Ape Escape to be remade, and while I'm not quite as keen on the whole idea as I once was, I'd even go as far as saying that I'd prefer something entirely new be done, it isn't the worst idea. Only it's already happened. Yes, Ape Escape on the Loose, the 2005 PSP remake developed in-house by Japan Studio. I'm aware that this isn't what fans have in mind when they talk about wanting to see the first game brought back, but there's nothing to be gained by ignoring it. By all intents and purposes, this is a full-on, from-the-ground-up reworking that allows you to enjoy the game on the go with updated graphics and all new voice lines. This again differs by region, but the North American version is greatly improved upon thanks to the inclusion of talent like Richard Stephen Horvitz, Steve Bradley Baker, and Jennifer Hale. I've always wanted to play a game where Rasputin Aquato catches crazy monkeys under the control of Captain Rex while FemChef tells me how much stuff there is to do in a level. The presentation is where On the Loose excels. While dated now, the graphics are a major step up from the PS1 game, and the redone soundtrack is equally as impressive. The unfortunate part is that the game falls short in just about every other area. Remember how I went on and on about the masterful use of both analog sticks that allowed for fluid gameplay? Well, you can kiss all of that goodbye. Awesome as it was, the PSP had its share of technical drawbacks, with the biggest here being the lack of a right thumbstick. As such, On the Loose adopts a more traditional control scheme that works well enough, but lacks the fluidity that made the original feel so good. This effectively dulls it down to a button masher, what with gadgets like the Super Hoop and Skyflyer calling for some serious hammering to be done. But those two are nothing compared to the RC car, which could previously be used whilst moving. Here you drive it around with the D-pad, and it just isn't as intuitive. I'm saying it's bad having played with a PS4 controller, so can you imagine how awkward it is on a tiny PSP with that little nub thing? Really makes you wonder why they chose to remake this game in particular when its use of the DualShock was such a defining quality. That'd be like remaking Mario 64 on the DS. Wait, they did that. And listen, I'm not trying to say that Ape Escape was only good because of how it played. There are a ton of other things that make it awesome, but taking away its biggest draw and undeniable selling point is no different from kneecapping it. Where you could originally attack in any direction, here you're limited to where Spike himself is facing. I found myself whiffing catches left and right, and though there is a small window where you can adjust the net's placement, I only realized it after I was well into the game. You almost have to forget everything you knew and begin from nothing, and while that isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's not exactly preserving the original experience. I realize that I might be coming across as a bit superficial, but if you've played the PS1 game, you'll know how much freedom there is in something as small as being able to use both analog sticks, and the fact of the matter is, you can't do that here. However, the majority of the game remains intact with the same lovable characters, well-designed levels, and cute monkeys. Collecting Spectre coins is still the means of unlocking minigames, however these are also a bit different. Since there's a lack of dual analog control, the skiing is replaced with snowboarding, and the boxing one plays more like a fight night game. Absent entirely is the space shooter with ping pong in its place. The strangest inclusion, however, are the Jake attacks levels. During the main game, these play out as a race between Spike and Jake, often making use of a gadget. So, why is it included among the bonus modes? Because Ape Escape on the Loose features multiplayer, and though I've no real way of showcasing it, it's exactly what you'd expect, with each minigame allowing you to go head-to-head with a friend. That isn't the only new addition, however, as hidden around select levels are potted plants, which when collected are stored in the lab where they can then be grown. But how does one grow plants, I hear you asking? With Doritos, of course. Yeah, collecting big energy chips sees these dudes blossom into large, wobbling trees that you can stand on. But they don't do very much else, so unless you're a total completionist, you're likely to pass these by. Most people don't even know they're in the game, which either means they're really well hidden or nobody ever cared enough to talk about them. It's just one of many oddities trumped only by the cutscene where Spike saves Natalie. After all the trouble they went through with re-recording the character's lines, this for whatever reason has the original PS1 audio, and it's easily one of the most jarring things I've ever paid witness to in a game, rivaled only by that one cutscene in Rayman 3 where Globox has a completely different voice. It's a hell of an oversight, and the worst part is, I'm pretty sure it only happens in the North American version, which was in the direst need of new stuff. Overall, it isn't too bad if you're new to the series, but the general consensus seems to be that it could have been much better. And I agree. But would you believe me if I told you that right now you could play Ape Escape on both the PS4 and 5? Despite neglecting the series for years, Sony finally got around to doing something with it, and though it may be a simple port, it's crazy to think that you can play Ape Escape, a PS1 game, on the newest Sony consoles. That's pretty crazy, even for a series that prides itself on going bananas. And that's Ape Escape, a game that not only defined the PlayStation, but also what's possible when you think outside of the box. Naturally, it was a huge success, with Spike and the Peepos becoming identifiable mascots that are still beloved by fans today. But it wasn't wholly thanks to the first game, as just as Sony would release the PlayStation 2, there'd also be the DualShock 2, and along with it, another Ape Escape. Technically, there would be a few more, but that's better kept for another time. So, I'll see you then.